All right, welcome back. So we're on part 2 of the Psychopharmacology series called Understand Antipsychotics Better. The series is going to be a 3-parter. I think the concept introduced in this video is going to be even more useful and practical than the one in the last video. So part 1 was about sequential binding and went into how Seroquel works. Part 2 is going to be about all the others, antipsychotics. But the market research team here at Psychofarm found that for whatever reason the viewership really connected with the fountains from part 1. So corporate made us rename this part. So let's jump into it. Part 2, even more fountains. So to get started, first I'm just going to list out the second generation antipsychotics in alphabetical order, and then next I'm going to circle the word pine, done, and pip and rip in the words. And I'm stealing this right from Stahl's Essential Farm book, where he endearingly coins the pines, the dones, 2 pips, and a rip. And once you realize the pines are similar and the dones are similar and the pips and rips are similar, it's just so much easier to keep the differences between the antipsychotics together. And I hope that after you watch this video, your brain just automatically views these as like subclasses of the antipsychotics and not just some, silly suffixes. I'll just rewrite the classes. You have the pines, which is olanzapine, quetiapine, clozapine; the dones, paliperidone, risperidone, ziprasidone, lorazepam; and then of course the pips and the rips, aripiprazole, brexpiprazole, and cariprazine. So now I'm just going to draw out the chemical structures of these drugs. And don't worry, I know a lot of people get intimidated with chemical structures, but don't freak out. Bear with me if you need to pretend you're in 3rd grade and just pretend we're looking at silly shapes, because that's all chemistry is. So I bring up the shapes because there's a reason that these drugs have their names, and there's a reason these drugs share certain properties. It's not just that these drugs have silly quirks that make them different. It's a result of their chemical similarity, and their similar properties are reflected in the receptors that they bind. So with this, we're not able to explain every effect that simply by looking at a drug's receptor profile, but it's the main paradigm through which we understand our medications today. So I think a big point that I'm making in a lot of these videos is that maybe this theory doesn't explain absolutely everything and every effect the drug has, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't learn it. And it's just a result of the fact that the brain and our mind are so complex that there's no comprehensive theory that explains every property of a drug, or it doesn't mean that this is it's wrong or it's not worth learning. I think you should learn everything you can in depth, and then also just be aware of its limitations. So I'm going to list out all the receptors that the drugs hit. And if you remember, it hits these receptors sequentially from left to right. And I think one thing that maybe I didn't emphasize enough in the last video is that a receptor doesn't necessarily need to be fully occupied before the drug moves on to the next receptor. The receptors exist in an equilibrium, so maybe it'll start moving on to the next receptors after the previous one is only 50% bound. But one thing, a lot of this stuff is theoretical, and in different papers you can even find different receptor profiles for the same drugs and different receptor affinities for the same drugs. But I really just want you to take away from these videos the general principles. So let me move on to how this is actually practical and clinically helpful to use. So I don't have a good memory for random facts. So looking at the receptors listed out like this, I would feel massively overwhelmed if I was told I had to memorize this. But now that you know the subclasses of the pines, dones, and pips and the rips, I think you'll be able to do it really easily. So without any further ado, I just want to introduce pine fountain, done fountain, and the pip rip fountain. So basically what these fountains are doing is recognizing there's a backbone that exists for the receptor classes within the pines, the dones, and the pips and the rips. So with these fountains, it's really easy to memorize, and you can understand the properties and the similarities of the drug classes, and also the side effect profiles of the different drug classes. As I said, the antipsychotic side effects, they're not just random properties of the drug. They come about because of a drug's receptor profile. So, for example, drugs that block histamine will cause sedation. Drugs that block M1, which are anticholinergic, will have anticholinergic side effects. So it'll cause dry mouth, urinary retention, tachycardia, constipation. M1 and H1, they both lead to sedation and are involved with weight gain. Drugs that block 5-HT2A will have less extrapyramidal side effects and less prolactin side effects. Drugs that block A1 will cause orthostatic hypotension and then a reflex tachycardia. So the reason why these fountains are useful is because you no longer need to just memorize the side effects, the specific side effects of the different antipsychotics, as if they're just completely random facts. If you know the fountains and the backbones, you can just intuit the side effects. So when you ask yourself, will quetiapine or ziprasidone have more sedation? Well, you can just think, the pines block M1 and block H1 and the dones don't. So you can just know just from the fountains that the quetiapine is going to be worse for that. So I just Googled and pulled a random chart of the antipsychotic side effects, and I found these things absolutely impossible to memorize. I'd rather slam my head against a wall than be forced to memorize whether Risperdal has 3 red circles or 1 yellow dot or 3 plus signs or one plus sign. I think these are kind of things I'll look at it for however long, and then 5 seconds after I'm done looking at it, completely forget. But once you know the pine, done, pip, rip pattern, looking through this thing is a piece of cake. So now, to make this chart manageable, I'm going to rearrange it in order of the pines, the pips, and the rip, and the dones. And once we throw the fountains that show the receptor profile backbones, this chart becomes very manageable. So if we look at something like sedation, which we know is caused by antihistamine and antimuscarinic, we'll see that for the pines, which have the H1M1 in the backbone, they're very sedating. And then aripiprazole and the dones, which don't have that, are less sedating. And then you look at the anticholinergic and you'll see the same thing, where the pine blocks M1, so those are more sedating than the dones and the pip rips, which don't block that receptor. As for weight gain and hyperglycemia, there's likely another receptor that we don't really know that is involved that is contributing to that. But H1 and M1 are also involved, so that's why when I look at the pines, which cause the most weight gain and the most metabolic side effects, we can see that those are worse. And then for the dones and the pips and the rips, they're just not quite as bad. And if you keep this concept of the pine, done, pip, rip in your head, eventually you'll be able to get the differences within the classes. So, for example, something like Seroquel, which, if you were to say what is all the receptors, it sounds like a daunting task. But when you take the fountain and then you add on to it the backbone to Seroquel, then you just add the receptors in between. So you would add alpha-1 and NET and 5-HT1A. And it's based off of the pine backbone, and it's just adding a few receptors. And then once you know those receptors, you can think of the side effects. So if you since we're adding alpha-1, we know we're going to get the orthostatic hypotension. Since we added the NET, we know we're going to get the antidepressant effect. So thinking of the receptors, it's not perfect. It's just not going to explain every single property of the drug, because our brains are complex and neurons are so complex, so that every theory is a bit reductionistic. But when you view it this way, it's really helpful as a way to just organize the differences of the drugs. And then to take the differences between the drug classes one step further, let's go back to the antipsychotic side effect chart, and let's pull up the pine class. So for the pines, we can look at the orthostatic hypotension, and we see for clozapine it hits A1 and quetiapine it hits A1, but the A1 receptor is missing for olanzapine, and sure enough, that's reflected in the side effects. We see, the quetiapine and clozapine has 2 dots and the olanzapine has 1 dot. And things I just want to show that once you think of the subclasses, you can see little patterns that exist within the classes. So, for example, quetiapine and olanzapine, those are 2 drugs that are indicated in treatment-resistant depression. And then olanzapine and clozapine, those are 2 drugs that have the absolute worst weight gain, but also are clozapine's the most effective and Zyprexa's a second most effective. Then you move to the dones, and you have paliperidone, which is the metabolite of risperidone. And then for something like ziprasidone and lurasidone, those are 2 drugs that are relatively, the best with weight, and also you need to take with food. And then with the pips and the rips, the Abilify or the brexpiprazole and cariprazine are more antagonistic, more on the antagonistic spectrum than Abilify. And I also like this one little thing my brain does is that since the RIP is different than the PIPs, the cariprazine also blocks D3. So these are just little patterns that you just kind of pick up on when you think of these things as different classes.